Hampshire, May, 1817. The morning mist refused to lift from the stone walls of St. Michael's Church in Millbrook, clinging to the weathered gray facade as though it carried some premonition of grief. Inside, the ancient building stood silent except for the occasional creak of settling timber and the soft rustle of ivory silk as Imogen Beatrice Wycliffe shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her bouquet of white roses trembling slightly in her gloved hands. 3 hours. She had been standing in this church for 3 hours, her mother and younger sister Constance seated in the front pew, their expressions having progressed from expectant to confused to deeply concerned. The vicar, Reverend Ashton, had excused himself 2 times, returning each time with increasingly apologetic glances that said more than his carefully neutral words. Something was wrong. Terribly, irrevocably wrong. Beneath the layers of carefully maintained composure, a cold dread began to constrict her chest, and Imogen already knew what this protracted silence signified. She recalled Adrian's uncharacteristic distance and evasiveness in the days preceding the wedding, a subtle signal her hopeful heart had chosen to ignore. If stories of resilience against society's cruelest betrayals touch your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You won't want to miss what happens next. The sound of rapid footsteps echoed through the church entrance, and for one desperate moment, Imogen's heart leaped with foolish hope. Perhaps Adrian had been delayed. Perhaps there was some explanation that would make sense of this interminable waiting. But the man who strode through the doorway was not Adrian Morland. Sebastian Lawrence Morland, Marquis of Clearwater, cut an imposing figure even in travel-worn clothing. At 6 feet 2 inches, with dark hair slightly disheveled from riding and eyes the color of winter storms, he possessed the kind of austere handsomeness that discouraged familiarity. His expression, as he took in the scene before him, transformed from confusion to comprehension, followed by something that looked remarkably like fury. "Miss Wycliffe," he said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a man accustomed to command. "Where is my brother?" The question, so direct and devoid of pretense, broke something inside her. Imogen felt her spine straighten with the particular rigidity that came from pride being the only thing holding one upright. "I was rather hoping you might know, my lord," she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "As you can see, I have been awaiting that answer myself for some considerable time." Sebastian's jaw tightened. He turned to his steward, who had followed him into the church. "Check the inn. Check every establishment in the village. Find him." As the man hurried away, Sebastian approached Imogen with measured steps. Up close, she could see the lines of fatigue around his eyes and the stiffness in his stance, the mark of a man burdened by relentless responsibility. He had the look of a man who carried responsibilities that had aged him beyond his 36 years. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Since 8 o'clock this morning," Imogen answered. "The ceremony was to begin at 9. It was now past 11. Sebastian's expression darkened further, and he turned to address Reverend Ashton. "Has there been any message? Any communication at all?" "None, my lord," the vicar replied, clearly distressed by the entire situation. "I sent my assistant to Lord Adrian's lodgings, but the landlady reported he departed before dawn. His belongings were gone." The terrible clarity dawned upon her. Imogen watched as understanding settled over Sebastian's features, followed by the unmistakable weight of true anguish. "Miss Wycliffe," he said, his voice rougher now, "perhaps we might speak privately." She should have refused, should have maintained the fiction that this was merely a delay, not an abandonment. But the gentleness in his tone, so at odds with his austere appearance, undid her carefully constructed composure. Very well. He led her to a small antechamber off the main sanctuary, closing the door to provide them privacy, while keeping it appropriately ajar. When he turned to face her, his expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I received a letter from Adrian 3 days ago," Sebastian began, each word seeming to cost him something. He wrote that he was urgently needed in Scotland for business matters and would return within a fortnight. I thought nothing of it at the time, as he has occasionally handled property surveys for me in the northern estates. Imogen felt her breath catch. Scotland. Yes. Sebastian's hands clenched at his sides. I have just learned from my steward that my brother departed for Gretna Green yesterday evening. He was not alone. The room tilted slightly. Imogen reached out to steady herself against the stone wall, the cold seeping through her gloves, grounding her in the nightmare that was unfolding. There is more, Sebastian continued, his voice now carrying a bitter edge. Adrian withdrew £4,000 from his account 2 days ago, the entire sum you brought as your marriage settlement. The words struck her like physical blows. £4,000. Everything her family had left after her father's death had revealed the true extent of their debts. The money that was supposed to secure their future, pay off the remaining creditors, provide her mother with a modest income. It was a sum which, Sebastian silently acknowledged, represented a painful and significant expense for him to replace. Gone. He told me it was for investments, Imogen heard herself say, her voice sounding distant and hollow. He said the settlement would be placed in trust, generating income for our household. Sebastian's face held the implacable quality of sculpture. My brother has never made a legitimate investment since he came of age. He has, however, accumulated considerable gaming debts at White's and several less reputable establishments. I must sincerely apologize for having to speak of such a gross failure of honor. The terrible clarity dawned upon her with devastating swiftness. Adrian's sudden courtship last autumn, his charming attentiveness, his pretty words, his eagerness to marry quickly. She had thought herself fortunate that such a handsome, affable gentleman had shown interest in a woman of 23 with a modest dowry and no particular beauty to recommend her. How utterly, completely foolish she had been. "Who is she?" Imogen asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The woman he fled with." "An actress from Drury Lane, I am told," Sebastian replied. "One Miss Rosalind Fletcher, known for her performances in comedies." The irony was not lost on her. Here stood Imogen, dressed in ivory silk and Brussels lace, abandoned in a church while her intended ran off to marry an actress. It would be the talk of every drawing room in 3 counties within a week. Her mother would be devastated. Constance's chances of any decent match would evaporate. The creditors her father's death had left circling would descend like vultures now that the settlement was gone. They would lose the house, the last remnant of better days. Everything was ruined. "Miss Wycliffe," Sebastian said, and something in his tone made her look up. His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed to see straight through her carefully maintained facade. "I must offer you my most profound apologies for the dishonor my brother has brought upon you and your family. The Moreland name has been tarnished by his actions, and that stain falls upon me as the head of this family." "You are not responsible for your brother's choices, my lord," Imogen replied, though the words felt hollow. "I am responsible for failing to see his true character," Sebastian countered. "I knew he was reckless, prone to poor judgment, but I did not think him capable of such calculated cruelty. I should have been more vigilant." He paused, his expression shifting to something resembling resolve, tinged with resignation. "I wish to make you a proposition, Miss Wycliffe, one that will, I hope, salvage something from this disaster." Imogen waited, though she could not imagine what solution could possibly exist for her circumstances. "Marry me instead." The proposal struck her like a physical blow, staggering her composure. "My lord, such a proposition is entirely out of the question," Imogen began, but Sebastian raised a hand. She thought instantly of her mother's dependence and Constance's future, a desperate wave of necessity washing over her, making the terrible choice clear. "Hear me completely before you refuse," he said. "You are already dressed for a wedding. The church is prepared, the vicar waiting. If we were to marry today, by special license, the scandal would be contained. Society would assume a simple substitution of groom, easily explained by some sudden circumstance that prevented my brother's attendance. Your reputation would remain intact. Your family would retain the security that was promised. But the settlement, Imogen protested. The £4,000 is gone. I will provide an equivalent settlement, Sebastian stated flatly. It was moorland money that was stolen from you, and it shall be moorland money that restores it. Consider it restitution for the harm my family has caused yours. Imogen stared at him, trying to comprehend what he was offering. You would marry a woman you do not know, do not love, to preserve her reputation? I would marry you to preserve my family's honor, Sebastian corrected, his tone businesslike. My brother has brought shame upon the Moreland name. This is the only way to mitigate that shame and prevent your complete ruination. As for love, I have no need of it, nor expectation of it. I require an heir for my estate, and you require security. It is a practical arrangement, nothing more. The coldness of his assessment should have offended her. Instead, Imogen found it oddly comforting. After Adrian's pretty lies and false affection, there was something almost refreshing about Sebastian's brutal honesty. What would you require of me? She asked, needing to understand the full scope of what he proposed. You would be Marchioness of Clearwater, Sebastian replied. You would manage my household, act as hostess when necessary, and provide me with an heir. In return, you would have a generous allowance, your family would be financially secure, and you would have the protection of my name and position. I would expect civility and discretion. Nothing more. Nothing more. No affection, no companionship, no love. A business arrangement, cold and transactional. It was also her only viable option. Very well, Imogen said quietly. I accept your proposal, Lord Clearwater. If she had expected any softening in his expression, any warmth or reassurance, she would have been disappointed. Sebastian merely nodded once, as though she had agreed to acquire a property rather than bind her life to his. He had made his intentions uncompromisingly clear. This was an act of duty and reparation, not affection. I will obtain a special license immediately, he said. We can complete the ceremony within 3 hours. I suggest you inform your mother of the change in circumstances. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Miss Wycliffe, he said, without looking back, I give you my word that I will treat you with respect and ensure your comfort. I may not be able to offer you affection, but I can offer you security and the dignity my brother denied you. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing away down the stone corridor, leaving Imogen alone in her wedding dress, about to marry a man who had made it abundantly clear he wanted nothing from her but duty. She pressed her gloved hand against the cold stone wall and allowed herself one moment, just one, to mourn the loss of every foolish dream she had harbored. Then she straightened her spine, smoothed her skirts, and went to inform her mother that she was, after all, getting married today. Just not to the groom anyone expected. The ceremony that took place at 2 o'clock that afternoon bore little resemblance to the celebration that had been planned. Sebastian returned with the special license, his expression as impassive as carved stone. Imogen's mother wept, though whether from relief or dismay was unclear, whilst Constance gripped her sister's hand throughout, her young face pale with shock and distress. Reverend Ashton performed the service with admirable composure, given the extraordinary circumstances. When Sebastian spoke his vows, his voice was clear and firm, each word a statement of obligation rather than affection. Imogen heard her own voice respond with matching steadiness, though she felt as though she were watching the scene from a great distance. The ring Sebastian placed on her finger was heavy gold, ornate and clearly old. A family heirloom, she supposed. It felt like a shackle. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Ashton intoned. My lord, you may kiss your bride. Sebastian leaned forward and placed the briefest, most perfunctory kiss imaginable upon her lips. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds and conveyed all the warmth of touching marble. They were married. The wedding breakfast that followed at the modest Wycliffe house was a subdued affair. Sebastian spoke primarily with Imogen's mother, assuring her that he would handle all outstanding debts and provide her with a suitable cottage and income on one of his estates. His efficiency was impressive, his manner polite but distant. He did not once look at Imogen with anything resembling personal interest. By 4 o'clock, they were in Sebastian's traveling carriage, heading toward Clearwater Manor in Berkshire. The interior of the coach was luxurious but austere, the leather seats comfortable but worn. Sebastian sat opposite her, his posture rigid, maintaining the required distance between them, his attention focused on papers he had retrieved from a case. They traveled in complete silence for the first hour. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Imogen spoke. "Will you tell me something of Clearwater Manor, my lord? I should like to know what to expect." Sebastian raised his gaze, surprise momentarily lifting his mask, seemingly surprised that she had spoken. "It is a large estate, approximately 8,000 acres. The house itself dates primarily from the 16th century, with additions made during Queen Anne's reign. There are 40 rooms, most of which have not been used in some years." "It sounds rather grand," Imogen ventured. "It was once," Sebastian replied, his tone neutral. "My father was not a good steward. He gambled extensively and made poor investments. When I inherited 10 years ago, the estate was heavily encumbered with debt. I have since restored its solvency, but it remains more functional than fashionable." There was no pride in his voice, merely statement of fact. Imogen sensed there was much more to the story, but his expression did not invite further inquiry. "I will do my best to manage the household to your satisfaction," she said. "Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, is competent," Sebastian replied. "She will instruct you in the routines of the house. Your primary responsibility will be to act as mistress of the estate when we entertain, which is infrequently." He returned his attention to his papers, the conversation apparently concluded. Imogen turned to look out the window at the passing countryside, her wedding ring heavy on her finger. This was her life now. A cold house with a cold husband, bound by obligation rather than affection. She would survive it. She had survived her father's death, the revelation of his debts, and this morning's humiliation. She would survive this too. She simply would not allow herself to hope for anything more. Clearwater Manor appeared through the trees as twilight descended, and Imogen's first impression was of overwhelming grayness. The house was indeed large, built of gray stone with multiple wings and tall chimneys. The grounds surrounding it were well maintained but austere, lacking the colorful gardens or ornamental features she had seen at other great houses. It looked, she thought, like the physical manifestation of its master's personality. The servants were assembled in the entrance hall to greet their new mistress. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 50, with iron gray hair and shrewd eyes. She curtsied to Imogen with perfect propriety, but no particular warmth. "Welcome to Clearwater Manor, my lady," she said. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you," Imogen replied, aware of the servants studying her with ill-concealed curiosity. No doubt they would soon hear the full story of this morning's debacle. Sebastian addressed the gathered staff with characteristic efficiency. "Lady Clearwater will require time to settle into her new home. Mrs. Hartley, please show her to her chambers. Dinner will be served at 7 o'clock. He turned to Imogen. "I must attend to some business matters in my study. Mrs. Hartley will see to your needs." Then he was gone, striding away down a corridor without a backward glance, leaving Imogen standing in the entrance hall of her new home, feeling like an unwanted guest rather than the mistress of the house. Mrs. Hartley led her up a grand staircase to the first floor, along a corridor lined with portraits of previous Morlands, all of whom seemed to regard her with the same cool assessment as their descendant. "These are the family apartments, my lady," Mrs. Hartley explained, opening a door. His lordship's chambers are at the end of the corridor. These rooms have been prepared for you. The chambers were spacious and well appointed, decorated in shades of cream and pale blue. A large bed dominated the space, its hangings embroidered with an intricate pattern. Tall windows overlooked the gardens. It was elegant and comfortable, and utterly impersonal. His lordship wished me to inform you that your apartments are entirely your own, Mrs. Hartley said, her tone carefully neutral. He will not intrude upon your privacy without invitation. The message was clear. This would be a marriage in name only. They would occupy separate chambers, live separate lives, connected only by legal obligation. Imogen managed a smile she did not feel. Thank you, Mrs. Hartley. That will be all for now. When she was alone, Imogen walked to the window and looked out at the darkening landscape. Somewhere out there, Adrian Morland was likely celebrating his clandestine marriage, spending her money, reveling in his escape. Meanwhile, she stood in a stranger's house, married to a man who had made it abundantly clear he wanted nothing from her but the fulfillment of duty. She had thought herself beyond tears after this morning's ordeal. She had been wrong. But Imogen Beatrice Morland, Marchioness of Clearwater, did not cry where anyone might hear her. She waited until full darkness had fallen, until she was certain no servant would disturb her, and only then did she allow herself to weep for the girl she had been that morning, who had still believed in love and happy endings. That girl was gone now, replaced by a woman who knew better than to hope for anything more than survival. Dinner that evening was an exercise in awkward formality. The dining room at Clearwater Manor was designed to seat 40 guests comfortably, making the sight of two people at opposite ends of the long mahogany table almost comical. Sebastian sat at the head, Imogen at the foot, with 20 feet of polished wood and Baroque silverware between them. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of cutlery against china and the soft footsteps of servants bringing courses. When Sebastian did speak, it was to make impersonal observations about the estate or ask perfunctory questions about her comfort. "I trust your chambers are adequate, Lady Clearwater," he said during the second course. It was the first time he had addressed her by her new title, and something about it made the reality of her situation even more stark. "They are very comfortable, thank you," Imogen replied, her voice carrying down the absurd length of table between them. "Should you require anything, inform Mrs. Hartley. She has managed this household for 15 years and knows it better than I do myself." Another silence fell, broken only by the arrival of the next course. Imogen forced herself to eat, though the excellent food tasted like ash in her mouth. She studied her husband covertly, trying to reconcile the man who had offered her salvation with the distant stranger who now regarded her with cool indifference. Sebastian's face, in the candlelight, was all harsh angles and shadows. His expression gave nothing away as he methodically worked through his meal, seemingly content with the silence. He possessed none of Adrian's easy charm, none of the quick smiles and flattering words that had first drawn her attention. But then, Adrian's charm had been the weapon he used to destroy her. Perhaps there was something to be said for cold honesty. After dinner, Sebastian excused himself to his study. "I have correspondence to attend to. Please feel free to explore the house and grounds as you wish. The library is through the main hall and to your left. It contains approximately 4,000 volumes." "Thank you," Imogen said. "I am quite fond of reading." For the first time since that morning, something almost like interest flickered across Sebastian's features. "Indeed. What are your preferences?" "History primarily," Imogen replied, "and travel narratives when I can find them." He nodded slowly. "The library contains a substantial collection of both. You are welcome to make use of it at any time." Then he was gone again, leaving her alone in the cavernous dining room. Imogen did venture to the library that evening, drawn by curiosity and the desperate need to occupy her mind with something other than the disaster her life had become. The room proved to be magnificent, 2 stories tall with galleries running along 3 walls and floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes. A fire burned in the massive fireplace, and comfortable chairs were arranged near it. It was the warmest room she had yet seen in the house. She spent 2 hours there, exploring the collections, eventually settling with a volume on the antiquities of Greece. The words on the page gradually soothed her frayed nerves, the familiar comfort of learning something new, providing a refuge from her churning thoughts. She did not see Sebastian again that night. The pattern established that first evening continued over the weeks that followed. Sebastian maintained a schedule of rigid formality. They breakfasted separately, he in his study and she in the morning room. They encountered each other occasionally during the day as they went about their separate activities, exchanging polite greetings that held no more warmth than one might offer a casual acquaintance. Dinner remained an exercise in awkward silence at opposite ends of the long table. Afterwards, Sebastian invariably retired to his study, while Imogen found refuge in the library. She learned the rhythms of the house, the routines of the servants, the expectations of her role. Mrs. Hartley proved to be an efficient teacher, though her manner remained coolly professional. The other servants treated Imogen with proper deference, but no particular warmth. She suspected they had loved the previous Marchioness, Sebastian's mother, and found this hastily acquired replacement wanting. Not that she could blame them. Imogen threw herself into her duties as mistress of Clearwater Manor, managing the household accounts, overseeing the servants, planning menus, arranging flowers. It kept her occupied and gave her purpose, even if the house itself seemed determined to remain cold and unwelcoming. She also spent increasing amounts of time in the library. The collection was extraordinary, clearly assembled by someone with genuine scholarly interests. She found rare volumes on ancient civilizations, comprehensive histories, accounts of exploration to distant lands. When she was reading, she could almost forget the loneliness of her situation. She often prepared for his evening visits by making herself comfortable in her reading chair. It was during one such evening, approximately 6 weeks after her wedding, that Sebastian unexpectedly entered the library. Imogen looked up from her book, startled. It was past 10 o'clock, and she had thought herself alone. Sebastian stood in the doorway, still dressed in his day clothes, a sheaf of papers in one hand. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his tone formal as always. "I did not realize you were here. I often work in the library in the evenings." "Please do not let me disturb you," Imogen replied quickly. "I can return to my chambers." "That is not necessary." Sebastian crossed to one of the large desks near the windows, settling himself and spreading out his papers. "The room is certainly large enough for 2 people to occupy without inconvenience." He began working, his attention focused on what appeared to be estate accounts and correspondence. Imogen returned to her book, acutely aware of his presence across the room. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the scratch of his pen, and the occasional rustle of turning pages. After perhaps 20 minutes, Sebastian spoke. "What are you reading?" The question was so unexpected that Imogen looked up in surprise. "Herodotus, my lord, an account of his travels in Egypt." "The histories," Sebastian said, his tone carrying a note that might have been approval. "An excellent choice. Have you reached his description of the pyramids?" "I have just begun that section," Imogen replied cautiously, uncertain where this unprecedented conversation might lead. "His observations are remarkably accurate," Sebastian continued. "I had occasion to consult that volume extensively when I was younger. My father had hoped I might undertake the grand tour, but circumstances prevented it." There was something in the way he said "circumstances" that spoke of disappointment long buried. "Were such travels a lifelong aspiration?" Imogen asked. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I did once. I had planned an extensive journey after completing my studies at Oxford. Egypt, Greece, perhaps even Persia. But my father died, and I inherited an estate drowning in debt and mismanagement. There was no time for such frivolities." The bitterness in his voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Imogen felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for this man who had sacrificed his own dreams to salvage his family's legacy. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been very difficult." "It was necessary," Sebastian replied, his tone flattening once more into his usual cool detachment. "One does what duty requires." The conversation ended there, but something had shifted imperceptibly between them. For the first time since their wedding, they had spoken to each other as two people rather than two strangers fulfilling obligations. It was not much, but perhaps it was a beginning. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Most evenings, Sebastian would enter the library where Imogen had already settled, and they would occupy the space in companionable silence, each absorbed in their own pursuits. Occasionally, they would exchange brief comments about what they were reading or working on. Imogen learned that Sebastian was methodically modernizing the estate's agricultural practices, implementing crop rotation systems and new breeding techniques for livestock. He spoke of it with a precision that bordered on passion, though his expression remained as austere as ever. Sebastian, in turn, learned that Imogen had a particular interest in ancient civilizations and a surprisingly sharp mind for analysis. She asked intelligent questions about his agricultural reforms, demonstrating an understanding of economics that he had not expected. They were not friends. They were not intimate. But they were gradually becoming something more than complete strangers. Then came the night that changed everything. It was early November, the weather having turned bitterly cold. Imogen had spent the day overseeing preparations for winter, ensuring the house was properly sealed against drafts and that sufficient fuel was laid in. By evening, she felt a sudden, profound exhaustion, a heaviness in her limbs that felt unlike simple tiredness. She settled in the library as usual, wrapping herself in a shawl against the chill that seemed to have seeped into her bones despite the roaring fire. Sebastian arrived shortly after, frowning slightly as he took in her appearance. "You look pale," he observed. "Are you unwell?" "Merely tired," Imogen assured him. "It has been a long day." But even as she spoke, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and she gripped the arms of her chair to steady herself. Sebastian was at her side immediately, his cool efficiency focused entirely on her. "You are ill. Mrs. Hartley must send for the physician at once." "It is nothing," Imogen protested weakly. "I simply need rest." But when she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. Sebastian caught her before she could fall, lifting her into his arms with surprising ease. "Do not argue," he said firmly, already carrying her toward the door. "You are burning with fever." The next days passed in a blur of delirium and pain. Imogen was only vaguely aware of being carried to her chambers, of the physician's arrival, of voices speaking in low, worried tones. The fever consumed her, dragging her into nightmares where she stood endlessly in an empty church, waiting for someone who would never come. In her delirium, she spoke. Words tumbled out that she would never have voiced in conscious thought. The humiliation of standing in her wedding dress for 3 hours. The moment she realized Adrian had abandoned her. The terror of complete ruin. The desperate gratitude mixed with bitter resentment when Sebastian had offered his cold bargain. "Nobody wanted me," she heard herself say, her voice raw and broken. "Not even for the money. I was not worth keeping." Through it all, there was a presence. Cool cloths on her burning forehead, water carefully spooned between her cracked lips. A deep voice murmuring words she could not quite comprehend, but that somehow anchored her to consciousness. Sebastian heard her confessions, the raw, wounded truth of her shame and suffering, and the pain in her voice broke through his carefully constructed emotional barriers. On the third night, the fever broke. Imogen woke to find herself in her own bed, weak as a kitten and disoriented. Pale dawn light filtered through the windows, and slumped in a chair beside her bed, his usually immaculate clothing rumpled and his dark hair disheveled, sat Sebastian. He had been there all night, perhaps all 3 nights. As if sensing her regard, Sebastian's eyes opened. For a moment, before his habitual reserve tightened his features once more, Imogen saw something raw in his expression, relief, and something else she could not quite name. "You are awake," he said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "How do you feel?" "Like I have been trampled by a carriage," Imogen admitted. "What happened?" "Fever. The physician believes it was an ague, though he could not be certain. You have been quite ill for 3 days." 3 days during which she gradually realized Sebastian had not left her side. His presence was evidenced in small ways, she noticed, as consciousness fully returned. A book on the bedside table that was his. A discarded cravat draped over another chair. The subtle scent of his cologne that permeated the room. "You stayed," she said, the words more question than statement. Sebastian's expression shuddered slightly. "You were delirious. You said things. I thought it best that only I should hear them." Shame flooded through her. She had spoken aloud her deepest hurts and fears while fevered and vulnerable, and he had witnessed all of it. "I apologize," she whispered. "You should not have been subjected to such displays." "Do not apologize." His voice was firm, almost harsh. "You have nothing to apologize for. The things you said, the pain you revealed, it was not weakness. It was truth. Truth about suffering you did not deserve and handled with more grace than most could muster." Imogen stared at him, seeing something in his gray eyes she had not seen before. Understanding. Recognition. As though in hearing her fevered confessions, he had truly seen her for the first time. "Rest now," Sebastian said, rising from his chair with visible stiffness. "I will have Mrs. Hartley bring you some broth. You must regain your strength slowly." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Imogen," he said, using her Christian name for the first time since their wedding. "You are worth far more than my brother could ever comprehend. That failure was his, not yours. Never doubt that." Then he was gone, leaving her staring after him with tears of profound, sudden relief streaming down her face, though whether from weakness, relief, or something else entirely, she could not say. Her recovery was slow. For 2 weeks, Imogen remained largely confined to her chambers, gradually rebuilding her strength. Sebastian visited 2 times each day, morning and evening, ostensibly to check on her progress. Their conversations during these visits were brief, but carried a new quality of genuine interest. He brought her books from the library, selecting titles he thought might interest her. She found herself preparing for his visits, a flutter of warmth in her chest, with an anticipation that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. When she was finally strong enough to leave her chambers, Imogen found that something had fundamentally shifted in the household. The servants treated her with noticeably more warmth, particularly after word spread that his lordship had personally nursed her through her illness. Mrs. Hartley's manner softened considerably, her efficiency now tempered with genuine concern. And Sebastian himself had changed, though the transformation was subtle. He still maintained his formal demeanor, but there were small differences. He smiled occasionally, brief glimpses of warmth that transformed his austere features. He inquired about her interests with genuine curiosity. At dinner, they actually conversed rather than enduring silence. The long table still separated them physically, but the distance between them felt less insurmountable. One evening in late November, as they sat in the library, their usual routine, Sebastian spoke without looking up from his papers. "I wrote to my solicitors this week," he said. "Your mother has been settled in a cottage on the eastern edge of the estate. It is modest but comfortable, with sufficient income to maintain her independence. Your sister may visit her there or remain with you here, as she prefers." Imogen looked up from her book, startled. "You did not need to do that. The settlement was generous enough to provide for them." "Your mother should not be dependent on allowances," Sebastian replied. "She should have her own home, her own security. It seemed the appropriate arrangement. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. He had not merely fulfilled his obligation. He had anticipated needs and acted to address them with genuine consideration. "Thank you," Imogen said softly. "That is very kind of you." Sebastian finally looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I did not marry you to punish you for my brother's sins, Imogen. I married you to provide protection and security. If I have failed to make you feel genuinely welcome in this house, that failure is mine to correct." "You have not failed," Imogen replied. "You have been nothing but honorable." "Honor is a low bar," Sebastian said, his tone carrying an edge of self-reproach. "You deserve more than cold civility and formal politeness. You deserve to feel that this is truly your home." Before Imogen could respond, he returned his attention to his papers, clearly uncomfortable with the personal nature of the conversation. But the words remained, hanging in the air between them like a promise. December arrived with heavy snows that blanketed the Berkshire countryside and left Clearwater Manor temporarily isolated. The house, which had seemed so cold and unwelcoming when Imogen first arrived, gradually transformed into something almost cozy as the household turned inward against the winter weather. Imogen found herself spending increasing amounts of time with Sebastian. They played chess in the library, discovering that they were evenly matched and equally competitive. They discussed books, debated points of history and philosophy, argued good-naturedly about agricultural reform and classical architecture. Sebastian, she discovered, possessed a dry wit that emerged when he was relaxed. Imogen found herself laughing more than she had in years, genuine amusement that bubbled up unexpectedly during their conversations. One snowy afternoon, as they sat by the library fire watching the storm rage outside, Sebastian spoke of his father. "He was a charming man," Sebastian said, his tone carefully neutral. "Everyone loved him. He could walk into any room and within minutes have everyone laughing and eating from his hand. My mother adored him. Society adored him." "But you did not," Imogen said gently. "I saw what his charm concealed," Sebastian replied. "The debts, the mistresses, the complete disregard for the responsibilities he owed to the estate and the people who depended on it. He gambled away 3 generations of careful stewardship in less than 20 years. When he died, I discovered that he had mortgaged nearly everything and spent the money on entertainments and expensive gifts for his various paramours." His hands clenched into fists, the only visible sign of the anger that still lived beneath his careful control. "I was 26 years old," he continued, "fresh from Oxford, full of plans for my grand tour and my future. Instead, I spent the next decade working 16-hour days to salvage what he had destroyed. Every penny I could scrape together went to paying debts, investing in improvements, rebuilding what he had squandered. There was no time for travel, for society, for any of the things young men are supposed to enjoy." "Is that why you are so cold?" Imogen asked, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Because you learned not to trust charm or easy affection?" Sebastian looked at her sharply, and she braced herself for anger. Instead, he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You are remarkably perceptive," he said. "Yes, I suppose that is precisely why. I learned that such easy flattery and engaging smiles often conceal only emptiness or worse. I learned that duty and responsibility matter more than fleeting pleasure. And I learned that letting anyone close meant risking the kind of devastation my father inflicted on my mother, who loved him desperately despite knowing exactly what he was. So you chose to feel nothing rather than risk feeling too much," Imogen said softly. "I chose to build something solid and lasting rather than chasing ephemeral happiness," Sebastian corrected. But his eyes, when they met hers, held something that looked almost like regret. The conversation stayed with Imogen long after that afternoon. She began to see Sebastian not as a cold, unfeeling man, but as someone who had buried his capacity for emotion beneath layers of self-protection. He had learned to survive by not wanting, not hoping, not allowing himself to become vulnerable. It was, she realized, not so different from what she herself had been doing since that terrible morning in the church. They had both erected walls around their hearts. The question was whether those walls could ever come down. Christmas passed quietly at Clearwater Manor. Sebastian gave Imogen a beautiful edition of Homer's Odyssey, the pages edged in gold and illustrated with exquisite engravings. She gave him a globe, antique and beautifully detailed, knowing his lost dreams of travel. They did not exchange these gifts at dinner or in any formal way. Instead, she left his on his desk in the library. He left hers in her reading chair. They acknowledged them with quiet thanks and said nothing more. But Imogen noticed that the globe appeared on Sebastian's desk, where he could see it while he worked, and she carried the Odyssey everywhere, treasuring it not for its material value, but for what it represented, that he had listened when she spoke, that he understood her loves, that he had thought of her pleasure when making his choice. The new year arrived, and with it came the first hints of spring. The snow gradually melted, revealing the sleeping gardens of Clearwater Manor. Imogen, restless after months of indoor confinement, began exploring the grounds more extensively. She discovered that beneath the austere exterior, the estate possessed remarkable beauty. There were rose gardens that would bloom spectacularly come June, a small ornamental lake surrounded by willows, winding paths through wooded areas where early snowdrops were beginning to emerge. One mild afternoon in late January, she was exploring a particularly overgrown section of garden when she discovered a small stone structure half hidden by ivy. Curious, she pushed through the undergrowth and found herself in what had once been an elaborate folly, a miniature Greek temple complete with columns and a marble floor. It was beautiful but clearly abandoned. Dead leaves covered the floor, and the structure itself showed signs of neglect. "My mother's project," Sebastian's voice came from behind her, making her start. "She had it built the year before my father died. She loved classical architecture and wanted her own private retreat for reading and contemplation." Imogen turned to find him standing at the entrance, his expression unreadable. "It is lovely," she said, "or was once." "I had it closed after she died," Sebastian admitted. "I could not bear to see it fall further into disrepair, but neither could I bring myself to restore it. It seemed like a monument to wasted hope." "May I ask what happened to her?" Imogen ventured carefully. Sebastian stepped into the folly, looking around at the neglected space with something like pain in his eyes. "She died of a broken heart," he said bluntly. "Oh, the physician called it a fever, but I knew better. My father's final mistress had been particularly brazen, flaunting the affair in ways that humiliated my mother publicly. She retreated here, to this folly, spending hours alone. When she took ill, it was as though she had simply lost the will to fight." "I am sorry," Imogen said. "That must have been terrible for you." "It was instructive," Sebastian replied, his tone hardening. "It taught me that love makes us vulnerable, that giving someone that much power over your happiness is dangerous, that it is safer to feel nothing than to risk that kind of destruction." Imogen understood then, with sudden clarity, why Sebastian had built such formidable walls around himself. He had watched love destroy his mother. He had seen charm and affection used as weapons. He had learned to equate emotion with weakness and vulnerability with danger. "Not all love is destructive," she said gently. "Your father's behavior was cruel, but that does not mean all affection leads to pain. Does it not?" Sebastian turned to face her fully. "You stood in a church for 3 hours, waiting for a man who had charmed you into believing his lies. My mother wasted decades on a man who cared nothing for her suffering. Where in these examples is the redemptive power of love?" The question hung between them, challenging and bitter. Imogen took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Perhaps love is not inherently good or bad. Perhaps it depends on the people involved. Your father was selfish and cruel. Adrian was dishonest and cowardly. But that does not mean all people who offer affection will betray it. And how does one know the difference? Sebastian asked. How does one distinguish genuine feeling from skilled performance? I suppose, Imogen said slowly, by watching what people do rather than what they say. Adrian made beautiful promises, but never once asked what I truly wanted or needed. You made no promises at all, yet you have thought about my comfort, my family's security, my interests. Which of those, I wonder, is the truer form of care? Sebastian stared at her, something shifting in his expression. For a long moment, they stood in the abandoned folly, the February wind whispering through the ivy, and Imogen felt that they were on the verge of something significant. Then Sebastian turned away abruptly. I should return to the house. I have correspondence to attend to. He left without waiting for her response, his retreat so hasty it bordered on flight. But Imogen remained in the folly, her heart beating rapidly, sensing that something crucial had just occurred, even if she could not quite articulate what it was. The days that followed were strange. Sebastian became more distant again, as though their conversation in the folly had frightened him into retreat. He still joined her in the library most evenings, but their conversations were stilted, carefully confined to impersonal topics. Imogen felt the loss of the tentative connection they had been building like a physical ache. Then, in early February, everything changed. A letter arrived from London, delivered by express rider. Sebastian read it in his study, and Imogen heard the crash of something being thrown, followed by a string of curses so profane she was shocked he possessed such vocabulary. She found him standing by his desk, the letter crumpled in one hand, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "What has happened?" she asked. "My brother," Sebastian said, his voice tight with rage. "My wastrel, cowardly brother has returned to England. He is in London and has sent me this letter requesting funds. Apparently his actress has left him, taking most of the money he stole from you. He now finds himself in dire financial straits and believes I will discharge his debts, as I always have." The casual mention of the money he stole from you crystallized something for Imogen. That money represented her family's entire security, the life her father should have left them. Adrian had taken it and squandered it on mistresses and gambling debts. "What will you do?" she asked. "Nothing," Sebastian said flatly. "I will not send him a single penny. Let him stew in the consequences of his own actions." But 3 days later, Adrian himself appeared at Clearwater Manor. Imogen was in the drawing room when the commotion erupted in the entrance hall. She heard raised voices, Sebastian's cold and commanding, another younger and wheedling. She should have stayed where she was. Instead, drawn by a morbid curiosity, she moved to the doorway where she could observe without being immediately seen. Adrian Morland looked nothing like the charming gentleman who had courted her. His clothing was rumpled and slightly shabby. His face was thinner, marked by dissipation and worry. But his smile, when he turned it toward Sebastian, still carried traces of the easy charm that had once fooled her. "Brother, surely you cannot be so heartless," Adrian was saying. "I made mistakes, I admit it freely. But I am your blood. You cannot simply abandon me to ruin." "I am not abandoning you to ruin," Sebastian replied, his voice cold as winter. "You accomplished that entirely on your own. You stole from a woman who trusted you, humiliated her publicly, and squandered everything on your own pleasure. Now you expect me to rescue you from the consequences. I will not." "It was business, Sebastian," Adrian protested. "A bad investment. You of all people understand that sometimes ventures fail." "Do not insult my intelligence by calling theft and abandonment a business venture," Sebastian snapped. "You took £4,000 from Miss Wycliffe under false pretenses, used it to fund your elopement with an actress, and now that she has abandoned you in turn, you come crawling home expecting forgiveness and funds. You will receive neither." Adrian's expression hardened, the charming mask slipping to reveal something uglier beneath. "You always were a sanctimonious prig, brother. high and mighty in your virtue. But let us speak plainly, you married her yourself quick enough. Quite the convenient arrangement, was it not? Rescue the fallen woman, claim the moral high ground, and secure a wife in the process. I wonder if she realizes she simply traded one opportunistic moorland for another. The words struck Imogen like physical blows. Was that how Adrian saw it? Was that how society would see it? Sebastian had saved her, yes, but had his actions diminished her inherent dignity, or were they driven solely by personal gain? Before her self-reproach could deepen, Sebastian moved. In 2 swift strides, he crossed the space between himself and Adrian, and struck him across the face with enough force to send the younger man stumbling backward. "You will speak of my wife with respect, or you will not speak at all," Sebastian said, his voice deadly quiet. "She has more honor in her smallest finger than you possess in your entire worthless existence." Adrian touched his reddening cheek, his expression shocked. "You struck me. Your own brother." "I should have struck you months ago," Sebastian replied, "before you had the chance to inflict your particular brand of destruction on an innocent woman. Now get out of my house. If you return, I will have you forcibly removed and barred from every property I own." "You cannot do this," Adrian protested. "I am family." "You ceased to be family when you became a thief and a coward," Sebastian said. "Now leave before I do something I may not regret, but which would upset my wife." It was the way he said, "my wife," with such firm possession and defense, that broke through Imogen's paralysis. She stepped into the hall, revealing her presence. Both men turned to look at her. Adrian's face showed a flash of shame before resentment hardened his features. Sebastian's expression was more complex, anger mixed with concern, and something that looked remarkably like fear. Imogen walked forward with all the dignity she could muster until she stood before the man who had abandoned her at the altar. "Lord Adrian," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest, "I have no words sufficient to express my contempt for your actions. You stole from me, yes, but more than that, you made me doubt my own worth. You made me believe I was unworthy of love or loyalty. That damage, I think, is worse than any financial loss." Adrian had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Lady Clearwater, I never meant to cause you such pain," he began, but Imogen cut him off. "Lady Clearwater," Imogen corrected sharply, "and I do not care what you meant. I care only what you did. You taught me a valuable lesson, though not the one you intended. You taught me that charm without substance is worthless, that pretty words mean nothing without honorable actions to support them, that I should never again trust appearances over evidence." She took a breath, gathering herself for what came next. "But I must thank you as well," she continued, the words tasting strange on her tongue. "Had you kept your word and married me, I would now be bound to a man incapable of honesty or decency. Instead, I am married to a man who has shown me more respect and consideration in 7 months than you showed me in 6 months of courtship. Your abandonment, devastating as it was in the moment, was ultimately a gift. It freed me to find something better." She turned to Sebastian, seeing his surprise at her words. "I do not need you to defend me, my lord husband," she said more softly, "but I appreciate that you would. Now, if you will excuse me, I find I have no desire to continue this conversation." She walked away, head high, leaving both men staring after her. Only when she reached her chambers did she allow herself to collapse into a chair, trembling with reaction. She had confronted Adrian, yes, but in doing so, she had also revealed far more of her feelings about Sebastian than she had intended. Something better. She had called her marriage something better. And the terrifying truth was that she meant it. When Sebastian came to her chambers that evening, his knock was hesitant, so unlike his usual assured manner. "May I enter?" he asked through the closed door. "Yes," Imogen replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He entered cautiously, as though expecting her to be fragile or upset. Instead, He found her seated by the window, composed if pale. "I apologize that you were subjected to that scene," Sebastian began. "I should have sent Adrian away immediately, rather than engaging with him where you might overhear." "I am not upset that I overheard," Imogen replied. "I am grateful, actually. I needed to see him, to say those words. It brought me a certain measure of vindication." Sebastian studied her face carefully. "You were remarkably brave, and remarkably kind, given what he did to you." "I was not kind," Imogen corrected. "I was honest. There is a difference." He moved further into the room, and in the lamplight she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control he was maintaining. "What you said," Sebastian began, then stopped, seemingly struggling with how to continue. "About finding something better? Did you mean that?" The question hung between them, weighted with significance. Imogen could lie, could retreat back behind the walls of polite civility they had both constructed. It would be safer, easier, but she found she no longer wanted safe or easy. "Yes," she said simply. "I meant it. These past months, living here with you, I have come to realize that there are different kinds of marriage, different ways to care for someone. Adrian promised me passion and romance, but delivered only betrayal. You promised me nothing but duty and delivered consideration, respect, and genuine interest in my well-being. If I must choose between pretty lies and honest action, I choose the latter every time." Sebastian's expression was difficult to read. "I have not been an easy man to live with. I am aware that I am cold, distant, difficult." "You are careful," Imogen corrected gently, her voice full of perceptive empathy. "You are guarded. You protect yourself because you have seen what happens when people do not. But Sebastian, I do not need you to be someone you are not. I simply need you to know that I see you. I see the man beneath the careful control, and I find him entirely worthy of esteem." For a long moment, Sebastian simply stared at her. Then he crossed the room in 3 long strides and sank to his knees before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Imogen," he said, her name a rasped confession. "I married you from duty, yes, but somewhere in these months, duty became something else entirely. When you were ill, delirious and feverish, I realized I could not bear to lose you. When Adrian spoke of you with such casual cruelty today, I wanted to do him genuine violence. Not because he had dishonored my family name, but because he had hurt you." His grip on her hands tightened. "I do not know if what I feel is love," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I have spent so long refusing to feel anything that I am not certain I recognize it anymore. But I know that thinking of you makes my day better. That hearing you laugh is one of the finest sounds I have ever known. That the thought of you being unhappy or suffering causes me actual pain. If that is not love, it is closer than I ever thought I would come." Imogen felt a flood of warmth and release, the tension of years washing away. She freed one hand to cup his cheek, feeling the unfamiliar rasp of stubble beneath her palm. "That is love, you stubborn, beautiful fool," she whispered. "And I feel it too. I have been falling in love with you for months now, so gradually I did not realize it was happening until today, when the thought of losing you to Adrian's poison words terrified me more than anything has since my father died." Sebastian released a single ragged breath that sounded like a groan of profound relief, pressing his face against her palm. He stood, pulling her up with him, his gray eyes locked on hers with the weight of years of longing. "I want to do this properly," he said. "Not a business arrangement or obligation. A true marriage, in every sense." "Yes," Imogen breathed. "Yes, I want that too." He swept her into his arms, carrying her to the bed with more certainty than he had shown that first night when he had carried her fevered form to this same room. This time, there was no illness, no emergency. Only 2 people who had found each other in the wreckage of betrayal and duty, and discovered that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings led to the deepest love. What followed was tender and passionate and healing in ways neither of them had anticipated. They discovered each other slowly, with the wonder of people learning that they were allowed to want, allowed to feel, allowed to love. And when dawn broke over Clearwater Manor, Imogen woke in her husband's arms for the first time, feeling truly married at last. The months that followed brought a transformation to Clearwater Manor that was visible to everyone. The house itself seemed to warm, as though the growing affection between its master and mistress had seeped into the very stones. Sebastian smiled more, laughed occasionally, and lost some of the rigid tension that had defined him. Imogen bloomed, her confidence growing as she realized she was genuinely valued and loved. She took a more active role in managing the estate, working alongside Sebastian on improvements and reforms. They became partners in the truest sense, consulting each other on decisions and valuing each other's insights. The abandoned folly was restored, and they claimed it as their sanctuary. They spent summer afternoons there, reading aloud to each other, planning their future, simply enjoying being together without the formality of the main house. When autumn arrived and Imogen discovered she was with child, Sebastian's joy was profound and unguarded. He became almost comically protective, though Imogen laughingly assured him that pregnancy was not an illness requiring constant supervision. Their first child, a daughter, was born in late spring. They named her Eleanor, after Imogen's late grandmother. Sebastian held his daughter with such tenderness that Imogen was flooded with emotion, watching the complete triumph of affection over his fear of feeling. 2 more children followed in the years after, a son and another daughter. Clearwater Manor transformed from the cold, lonely house Imogen had first entered into a home filled with laughter, warmth, and love. 5 years after that terrible day when she had stood abandoned in a church, Imogen and Sebastian stood once again before St. Michael's in Millbrook. But this time, they came not for a wedding, but to commemorate something far more important. They had established a charitable foundation in the church's name, dedicated to helping women in desperate circumstances, women abandoned by promises made, women facing ruin through no fault of their own, women who needed not rescue, but resources and support to rescue themselves. The foundation was Imogen's project, but Sebastian had supported it completely, using his wealth and influence to make it a reality. Already, they had helped dozens of women, providing financial assistance, legal support, and practical aid. As they stood before the church where her nightmare had begun, their 3 children playing nearby under the watchful eye of their nursemaid, Sebastian took Imogen's hand. "This place witnessed your worst moment," he said softly, echoing words he had spoken before. "But look at what has grown from those ashes. You have taken your pain and transformed it into help for others. You have turned betrayal into strength, humiliation into purpose." "We did this together," Imogen replied, squeezing his hand. "I could not have built any of this without you. And I would still be locked in my study, hiding from feeling anything, if you had not taught me that walls built to keep pain out also keep love from entering," Sebastian countered. Imogen smiled, watching their eldest daughter chase her younger siblings across the churchyard. "Do you ever regret it? That morning when you decided to marry a stranger rather than let scandal spread?" Sebastian turned her to face him, his gray eyes warm with the love he no longer tried to hide. "I regret nothing. That morning, I thought I was saving you from ruin. I did not realize you would save me from a different kind of ruin entirely. A life empty of joy, of connection, of love." He kissed her gently, uncaring of the villagers passing by, who smiled at the sight of the Marquis and Marchioness of Clearwater, so obviously devoted to each other. "Adrian's abandonment, as devastating as it was, gave me you," Imogen said when they parted. "It forced me to see that charm without substance is worthless, that real love is built not on pretty words, but on consistent action, on seeing and being seen, on choosing each other every day." "We both learned that lesson," Sebastian agreed. "My father taught me to fear emotion. Adrian taught you to doubt promises. But together, we learned that the right person, at the right time, can teach us to trust again, to hope again, to love again. Their son called out, asking his father to come watch him climb a tree. Sebastian laughed, the sound still surprising and delightful to Imogen even after 5 years of marriage. "Duty calls," he said with mock solemnity. "Our heir apparent requires supervision in his tree-climbing endeavors." "Go," Imogen urged. "I will speak with the vicar about the next distribution of funds." As Sebastian strode away to join their children, Imogen took one last look at the church where she had stood alone and humiliated, believing her life was over. She thought of the girl she had been that morning, broken and despairing, and wished she could tell her what was coming. The pain would matter. The humiliation would matter. But it would not destroy her. Instead, it would forge her into someone stronger, wiser, and ultimately happier than she could have imagined. It would lead her to a man who saw her worth when she could not see it herself. It would give her a love built on solid ground rather than shifting sand. Sometimes, Imogen reflected as she walked into the church to continue the work of helping others, the worst moments of our lives are simply the doorways to the best moments we have yet to live. We just have to be brave enough to walk through them. And on the other side, if we are very fortunate, we find not rescue, but partnership. Not salvation, but mutual growth. Not a fairy tale, but something better. A real love, earned through honesty and sustained through choice. That, she had learned, was worth more than any romantic dream. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, resilience, and hope.